There are moments in life that stop you completely, not because they are loud or dramatic, but because they are so quietly real that they reach straight into your chest and press there like a hand against your heart. July 17, 2026 was one of those moments. It was Queen Camilla's 79th birthday, and on the surface, it looked like any other royal occasion: a portrait released, birthday wishes shared online, flowers cut from a garden, tea poured in a country house sitting room. But something different was happening inside the walls of Highgrove that day. Something that no palace announcement could fully capture. Something that had been building for years quietly beneath all the headlines and the controversy and the weight of history. A young girl, barely 11 years old, did something so simple, so genuine, so completely unexpected, that the people who witnessed it said the room went still. And Queen Camilla, a woman who had spent over 2 decades learning to carry the world's judgment with grace, felt something she hadn't expected to feel on her birthday. She felt seen. This is that story. She was born Camilla Rosemary Shand on a July morning in 1947 into a world that was still piecing itself back together after the war. Britain was different then. The monarchy felt distant, elevated, untouchable. Kings and queens lived in a separate universe from ordinary people, and the idea that a woman like Camilla, raised in country houses and educated in finishing schools, shaped more by rolling English gardens than by palaces, would one day stand at the very center of the British royal family would have seemed completely impossible. But that is exactly what happened, and the road that brought her there was anything but smooth. When Camilla married King Charles III on April 9, 2005, in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, it was not the kind of royal wedding the world tends to celebrate. There were no cheering crowds lining streets for miles. There was no fairytale gown or cathedral full of flowers. It was quiet, measured, and shadowed by everything that had come before. The memory of Princess Diana, her beauty, her warmth, her tragedy, still sat in the public imagination like something sacred. And Camilla, for all her intelligence and resilience, had spent years being cast as the villain in that story. The woman who had broken something irreplaceable. The woman who had stood in the way of a love the world had wanted to believe in. The British public did not receive her kindly. That is perhaps an understatement. For much of the 1990s and early 2000s, she was one of the most disliked women in the United Kingdom. Newspaper columnists were brutal. Public polling figures were grim. People who had never met her had decided who she was, and that decision, once made, felt almost impossible to undo. And yet she endured. She showed up, she stood beside Charles. She carried out her duties without complaint and without drama, and she did it year after year, long before anyone was cheering for her, long before the cameras were positioned favorably, long before the word remarkable started appearing next to her name in the press. What changed her public image was not a single dramatic moment. It was time. It was consistency. It was the steady, unglamorous work of being present when presence was required, and being warm when warmth was all she had to offer. Slowly, year by year, the public began to see something they had not been willing to see before. They saw a woman who genuinely loved her husband. A woman who found joy in books, in gardens, in dogs, in the straightforward pleasures of a life lived close to the earth. A woman who laughed easily and listened carefully, and never seemed to be performing a version of herself designed for anyone else's approval. By the time Queen Elizabeth II passed away in September 2022, and Charles and Camilla ascended to the throne as king and queen, something had shifted in the country's relationship with her. She was not universally beloved. No one in her position ever could be, but she was respected. More than respected in many quarters, she was admired. And then came King Charles's cancer diagnosis in 2024, and everything shifted again. Charles had always been the one who stood in front, the one the world had watched since his earliest childhood, the heir apparent since before most people alive today were born. He had been the center of the monarchy's future for so long that it was easy to forget he was also a human being who could get sick, who could be frightened, who could need support just as desperately as anyone else. Camilla became that support, not reluctantly, not as a matter of duty. She became it because she chose to completely, and because she did not seem to consider the alternative. She stepped forward. She took on more public engagements. She continued to work through the quiet terror of not knowing how things would unfold. She sat with him during treatments and stood beside him at events when he was well enough, and she kept going when the weight of it all must have been almost unbearable. The country watched, and the country took note. By the summer of 2026, her approval ratings had risen to levels no one could have predicted when she first stepped into the public eye as Charles's companion. Royal commentator Jasmine Carey, speaking to several media outlets in the weeks before the birthday, said simply that Camilla's dedication had shown the world what a remarkable individual she was. That was the phrase being used everywhere now. Remarkable. As though the word had been reserved specifically for this moment in her life. This late chapter that had turned out to be, against all expectation, her brightest one. July 17, 2026 arrived on a Friday. It was the kind of summer morning that Gloucestershire does particularly well, soft light over green fields, air that smells of something growing, sky wide and pale blue above the hills. Highgrove, King Charles's beloved country estate where he and Camilla had spent so many of their private hours over the years, was exactly the kind of place where a birthday like this one felt right. There were no grand ceremonies planned, no state banquets, no formal receptions. Royal butler Grant Harold, who served Charles from 2004 to 2011 and had watched Camilla's transformation up close during those years, had told reporters the week before that the royals always celebrated Camilla's birthday in the garden at Highgrove, depending on the weather. And the weather on this particular morning was cooperating beautifully. The family was gathering, not in the vast, formal way that royal occasions sometimes demand, but in the smaller, quieter way that Camilla had always preferred, the way she had spent most of her birthdays even before the crown made them something people wrote about. Her two children from her first marriage, Laura Lopes and Tom Parker Bowles, were expected, close friends who had been beside her through every chapter of her life, and the Wales family, William, Catherine, and the children. It was that last detail that had made the morning feel different, even before anything had happened. Because there is something about the presence of children at a birthday that changes the atmosphere entirely. Children don't observe occasions the way adults do. They don't calculate what to say or how to behave. They don't manage their expressions or their affection. They simply arrive, and they bring the full weight of their realness with them. Princess Charlotte arrived at Highgrove that morning the way she always does things, with a quiet self-possession that has struck royal observers since she was very small. She is 11 years old now, this daughter of William and Catherine, this girl who stands third in line to the throne, and who has been photographed at state occasions and royal ceremonies and sporting events for most of her life. But there is something about Charlotte that consistently refuses to be flattened by all of that. She has her mother's steadiness and her father's directness, and she carries herself in public with a composure that seems almost inexplicable in someone so young. But she is also still completely, unmistakably a child, curious and warm and quietly perceptive in the way that some children simply are, as though they are paying closer attention than the adults around them realize. She had been paying attention to Queen Camilla for a while now. That was the thing that people closest to the family had noticed over the past couple of years. Charlotte had developed a genuine fondness for her step-grandmother, not the polite, performed fondness that royal children are sometimes coached into displaying at public events. Something more genuine than that. Something that had grown, slowly and naturally, from real contact and real time spent together. There had been a moment, back in May 2023 at the coronation concert at Windsor Castle, that had been captured on camera and had circulated widely ever since. Charlotte, then just 8 years old, had been trying to curtsy to her grandfather King Charles as he entered the royal box, and in her concentration she had turned away from Camilla, missing the moment to offer the same curtsy to her step-grandmother. It was the kind of small stumble that children make at formal occasions, the kind that makes everyone in the room hold their breath. But Camilla had simply placed a hand on Charlotte's shoulder as she passed, a brief, gentle reassurance that said, "It doesn't matter, you're fine, I've got you." And Charlotte had looked up and smiled, and the moment had passed. But it hadn't passed, really, not for Charlotte. Because some gestures stay with you. Some kindnesses, particularly the ones that are offered quietly, without any audience or expectation, without needing to be seen, land in a way that the big, visible ones never quite manage. Camilla had made Charlotte feel comfortable in that moment, had smoothed over a small embarrassment with the ease of someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be in the spotlight when you'd rather be invisible. And Charlotte, at 8 years old, had filed that away somewhere important. Now she was 11, and it was Camilla's 79th birthday, and Charlotte had spent several weeks thinking about what she wanted to do. The portrait that Buckingham Palace had released to mark the birthday had gone out the previous day, Thursday the 16th. It was taken by Getty's royal photographer Chris Jackson in the state drawing room of Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland. A beautiful image, Camilla beaming in a room full of history, wearing a diamond and sapphire butterfly brooch that had once been presented to Queen Elizabeth II at the Birmingham Spring Fair in February 1977. There was something fitting about that detail, Camilla wearing a piece of jewelry connected to the woman whose shadow had once seemed so impossible to step out from. The portrait was elegant and warm, but it was also, in a sense, official. It was the version of Camilla that the institution presented to the world. What Charlotte had prepared for the private birthday at Highgrove was something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with portraits or palaces or the machinery of monarchy. Something that was meant only for Camilla, and that came purely from a child who had been paying attention. The morning light came through the Highgrove windows long and golden by the time everyone had settled, and the garden, Charles's extraordinary, eccentric, beloved garden that he had spent decades shaping and nurturing, was at its absolute summer peak. Flowers were open and generous. The air smelled of herbs and cut grass. It was the kind of morning that makes you feel, briefly but genuinely, that the world is functioning exactly as it should. King Charles, who was present and in relatively good spirits despite the ongoing management of his illness, had arranged for Camilla's favorite things to be in place: quiet surroundings, good company, no unnecessary formality. Grant Harold had mentioned to reporters that when it came to gifts for a non-milestone birthday, Charles would likely look to his garden for inspiration. And true to that suggestion, the morning had the feel of something grown rather than bought, unhurried and organic, shaped by love rather than occasion. Everyone had gathered in the sitting room first, with its familiar clutter of books and photographs, and the particular warmth that only houses that are truly lived in can produce. Camilla moved through the room the way she always does, stopping to speak to everyone, genuine in her attention, never performing. Laura and Tom were there, her children from her years with Andrew Parker Bowles, the years before all of this, the years of an ordinary life that had turned into something no one could have written convincingly as fiction. Old friends were there too, women who had known Camilla before the crown and had remained beside her through everything, the kind of friendships that survive intact because they were built on something real before the world decided to have opinions. And then William and Catherine were there, standing close together in the way they tend to do in private settings, relaxed and genuinely affectionate. Catherine, whose own years of navigating royal life have given her an understanding of what Camilla has been through that few others could match, had greeted Camilla with a warmth that those present found visibly moving. The two women had always gotten along, had always shared what one close friend described as a common goal of supporting their husbands and supporting the crown, but there was something in the room that morning that felt deeper than alliance. It felt like genuine care. Like two women who had each found their footing in a world that had not always made that easy, and who recognized something of their own experience in each other. And then there was Charlotte, quiet, self-contained, holding something she had brought herself, waiting for her moment. There's a particular kind of morning that only happens in the English countryside in midsummer, and Highgrove was full of it on July 17, 2026. The kind of morning where the light seems to take its time, moving slowly across lawns and hedgerows, lingering on the faces of the flowers Charles had spent 30 years carefully choosing and placing in his extraordinary garden. The kind of morning where time slows down just enough for people to actually see each other. Queen Camilla had always loved mornings like this. Long before she was a queen, long before the title and the crown and the weight of everything that came with it, she was a woman who found her truest self outdoors, in gardens, near animals, in the uncomplicated company of the natural world. She had a private home in Wiltshire Ray Mill House, a place she had bought for herself in 1996 after her divorce from Andrew Parker Bowles, a place that represented her independence and her peace. It was there, in the garden, that the birthday portrait she had taken the previous year had been shot, Camilla leaning on a fence, smiling easily at the camera, wearing an expression that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with genuine happiness. But today she was at Highgrove, and there was something about being at Highgrove on a birthday that always felt different. This was the house that contained so much of their shared life, hers and Charles's, the gardening conversations, and the dinner parties, and the dogs, and the early mornings, and the quiet evenings that had made up the texture of their marriage long before anyone outside the walls of the estate was particularly interested in celebrating it. This was a house that held memory in its walls. And on a birthday, memory has a particular weight. She was 79 years old. She was, by any measure, in the late chapter of her life, and she appeared to know it and to be at peace with it in a way that struck people around her as quietly extraordinary. A close friend who had spoken to the press in the days before the birthday described her as a woman who was living her life in reverse, meaning that the things most people get in their youth, the recognition, the affirmation, the feeling of being truly valued, Camilla was only now receiving in full. And she was receiving them not with the breathless hunger of someone who had waited too long, but with the calm appreciation of someone who understood that the timing, strange as it was, had actually been right. She had marked her birthday in the days leading up to it, with an announcement that said something important about who she was and what she cared about. Through the National Literacy Trust, of which she was patron, and in celebration of the National Year of Reading 2026, Camilla had announced that every child in Year 6 and P6 across the United Kingdom would be gifted a special edition of Impossible Creatures, the best-selling novel by award-winning author Catherine Rundell, as a Christmas present from the Crown. Each copy would carry a royal stamp on the cover and a personal message from Camilla inside, a message she had written herself, in her own voice, for children she would never meet but was thinking about nonetheless. This was not the gesture of someone performing charity for cameras. This was the act of a woman who had loved books her whole life, who had spoken about the transformative power of reading since long before it was useful to her politically, and who wanted to do something that would last. It was the kind of birthday announcement that made people stop and reconsider whatever version of Camilla they had been carrying in their heads. Inside Highgrove, the morning was unfolding gently. There was tea, naturally. This was Camilla's birthday and the British royal family, and there were flowers from the garden cut that morning, the way Charles apparently preferred to give things, from his hands to hers, from the earth he tended to the person he loved. It was a small gesture, but it was completely him. Grant Harold, who had watched the couple closely for 7 years, had told reporters that he thought the king would look to his garden for her gift. And that is exactly what happened, not because Charles was uncreative, but because for him, the garden was the most intimate language he had. It was where he expressed things he couldn't always say out loud. Charlotte had been watching the morning unfold with the focused patience of a child who knows she has something to do and is waiting for exactly the right moment to do it. She had been thinking about this for weeks. That was the part that none of the formal birthday coverage could capture, the weeks of quiet preparation that had preceded this morning. Because Charlotte had not arrived at Highgrove with something bought in a shop, or something chosen by an aide, or something selected because it was appropriate for the occasion. She had arrived with something she had made. Something she had worked on by herself, in her own time, with her own hands, without telling anyone what she was doing until it was finished. It was a letter, but calling it a letter doesn't quite capture what it was. It was several pages long, written in Charlotte's careful, slightly formal handwriting, and it said things that an 11-year-old, even a highly composed and perceptive one, rarely says out loud. It talked about what it had been like to watch Camilla over the past few years. It talked about the moment at the coronation concert, the stumbled curtsy, the hand on the shoulder, the way Camilla had made the embarrassment disappear so gently that Charlotte hadn't even properly registered being embarrassed until later, when she thought back on it. It talked about watching Camilla stand beside the king through his illness, going to engagements when she must have been frightened, continuing to show up when showing up must have required something enormous. It talked about what that had looked like from where Charlotte was standing, the perspective of a girl who was watching and learning what it means to be a woman in this family, in this role, in this world. And it said very simply that Camilla had shown her something important, that you can keep going, that you can face the things you didn't choose and carry them with dignity, that the world's opinion of you is not the same thing as your worth. An 11-year-old had written that. Those around her said it was written in her own words, not coached, not drafted by anyone else, not reviewed before she sealed the envelope. Just Charlotte, alone in her room, writing to a woman she had been watching and thinking about, and in the way of children who are paying close attention, quietly loving. The moment she gave it was private. It happened not in the middle of the room, not during a toast or a formal gathering of the group. It happened in a quieter moment, when the two of them were in the same space and Charlotte simply walked over and handed Camilla the envelope and said, in that composed, matter-of-fact way she has, I made you something for your birthday. Camilla took the envelope and opened it with the unhurried attention she gives most things, and she began to read. And those who were near enough to observe said that what happened to her face in the next few minutes was something they had not seen before. Not the polished warmth of a public appearance. Not the gracious smile of a woman who is accustomed to receiving tributes and knows how to receive them well. Something unguarded. Something that caught her by surprise. She read slowly. She read it more than once. And when she looked up, her eyes were bright in the way that they get when something has reached past the surface and touched something that doesn't normally get touched. She didn't say a great deal. That is a detail that people who were present later mentioned specifically. The fact that Camilla's response was not eloquent or extensive. She simply looked at Charlotte for a moment with an expression that held more than words could have managed, and then she reached out and held the girl's face in both her hands briefly and said, "You see things, don't you?" It wasn't a question, it was a recognition. Charlotte, for her part, didn't look away. She held the gaze, and she nodded, in the way of someone who has known something for a while and is glad it has finally been acknowledged. And then the moment passed, the way moments do in houses full of people and tea and the ordinary forward motion of a birthday morning. But it didn't really pass. The people who saw it carried it with them out of that room, because what they had witnessed was not a royal performance. It was not an event planned for cameras or timed for maximum effect. It was something rarer and more lasting than any of that. It was a child telling a woman who had spent her whole public life being judged that she had been seen by at least one person, truly and accurately, and that what she had done with her life mattered. And outside the windows of Highgrove, the July garden went on being beautiful in the uncomplicated way of gardens that are tended well, and the summer light kept moving slowly across the lawn, and nothing about the day looked particularly different from the outside. But inside, something had shifted. Something that had nothing to do with the monarchy and everything to do with two people, 179 and 111, finding each other across the distance that age and title and circumstance are supposed to maintain between them. It was, in the quietest possible way, a stunning moment. And it was only the beginning of what the day would hold. Because while Charlotte's gesture had opened something in Camilla that morning, the afternoon would bring its own weight, the weight of a man she loved, doing his best to be present on her birthday, fighting a battle that neither of them talked about in public and both of them lived with every single day. King Charles, the man who had loved her for 50 years, the man who was ill, the man who had stood in the garden that morning and cut flowers for her with his own hands. That part of the story was still coming. By the time the afternoon arrived at Highgrove, the morning's quiet had deepened into something else entirely. The kind of afternoon stillness that comes over a house when a group of people who love each other have been together long enough to stop performing and simply be. Children had moved between rooms. Dogs had appeared and been fussed over. Someone had brought out more tea. The birthday cake, and there is always a birthday cake at Camilla's birthdays because she has never outgrown the pleasure of them, had been sitting on the kitchen table since mid-morning, waiting patiently. But the thing that dominated the afternoon, the thing that everyone in that house was quietly aware of without anyone saying it out loud, was King Charles. He was 77 years old and he was fighting cancer. That fact, which had entered the family's life in early 2024, had not gone away. It had shifted and changed in the way that these things do. There were better days and harder ones, periods of relative stability followed by adjustments to treatment, a constant management of something that could not simply be removed and set aside. He had continued to carry out public engagements where he was able. He had shown extraordinary courage in his public appearances, that particular kind of courage that involves not making your struggle the loudest thing in the room when there are duties to be performed and people who need to see their king standing upright. But those who were close to him saw the cost of that, and no one had seen it more clearly or paid for it more personally than Camilla. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being the primary support for someone you love who is ill. A loneliness that is not about being alone, quite the opposite. It is the loneliness of carrying fear in your chest while keeping your face composed. Of sitting beside someone during a treatment and holding their hand and saying something ordinary about the weather or the garden or what you had for lunch, because ordinary conversation is sometimes the most loving thing available. Of going out in public and smiling for cameras and shaking hands and remembering names and fulfilling obligations, while in the back of your mind, there is a door you cannot open while you are standing there. A room full of everything you are trying not to think about until you get home. Camilla had been living inside that particular experience for over 2 years, and she had done it without complaint, without public disclosure, without ever appearing to use Charles's illness as a vehicle for her own sympathy or attention. She had simply continued, and in continuing, she had demonstrated something about the nature of devotion that the public had responded to in a way that transcended the usual categories of royal approval. On this birthday, Charles was well enough to be present. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. He had been in the garden in the morning, moving among his plants with the attention he always gives them, the intense, almost meditative focus that people who have spent time with him at Highgrove consistently describe. This garden was one of the great works of his life, not a royal project, not an official initiative, but a personal creation, 30 years of vision and labor, a place that expressed something about him that no speech or public appearance ever quite managed. He knew every corner of it. He had planted things he would not live to see fully grown, and he had done it deliberately, the way people plant for the future when they are thinking beyond themselves. That morning he had cut flowers for Camilla's birthday, not had them cut or arranged for them to be cut. He had done it himself. And when he brought them to her, in the particular unhurried way he moves when he is being tender with someone, that small act contained everything, 50 years of history, the entire arc of a love story that the world had once wanted to condemn, and now, strangely, found itself moved by. Camilla had received them the way she receives things from him in private, with a complete absence of formality, with the ease of two people who have been intimate for long enough that small gestures don't require performance. She had taken the flowers and touched his hand and said something quiet that no one else heard, and that was enough. By the afternoon, Charles had settled into the day at the comfortable pace his health currently required. He was present, engaged, genuinely happy, or as genuinely happy as a man managing a serious illness can allow himself to be on a day that calls for happiness. He sat with family. He spoke to the grandchildren, George, Charlotte, Louis, with the warmth that those who know him say he reserves almost entirely for private settings, the warmth that his public persona often doesn't fully communicate. He was funny. He was interested. He was, by all accounts, himself. And Camilla watched him all afternoon with the attention of someone who is grateful for ordinary moments precisely, because she has learned not to take them for granted. Charlotte had moved through the day with the particular grace of a child who has done something important and doesn't need it acknowledged again. The letter had been given. The moment had happened. She had moved on in the way of children into the rest of the day, into cake and dogs and conversation with her brothers, and the uncomplicated pleasure of a family afternoon in a garden that happened to be extraordinary. She was seen sitting beside Camilla at one point during the outdoor portion of the afternoon, not talking particularly, just there, in the easy proximity of two people who have reached some understanding. It was Catherine who, speaking privately to a close friend in the days that followed, put into words what most people who had been there were struggling to articulate. She said that watching Charlotte give Camilla that letter had been one of the most moving things she had witnessed within the family. Not because it was dramatic or significant in any official sense, but because it was real. Because her daughter had done something that most adults, including most adults in the royal family, including herself, would not have known how to do. Charlotte had looked at a woman who had been through a great deal, and she had said, "I see you. Not as a queen, not as a step-grandmother, not as a figure in a public story, just as a person." And that is, in Catherine's words, the rarest and most generous thing one person can offer another. The birthday portrait released by Buckingham Palace, the official image taken by Chris Jackson in Hillsborough Castle's state drawing room, showed Camilla wearing the butterfly brooch that had once belonged to Queen Elizabeth. It was a detail that royal observers had noted immediately, reading significance into the choice of jewelry. A brooch from the late queen, worn on the birthday of the current one. A passing of something between women, a quiet lineage. But there was another kind of lineage playing out at Highgrove that afternoon, one that didn't appear in any official portrait, one that involved a girl of 11 and a woman of 79, and the bridge of understanding that had formed between them across all the years and titles and complexity that were supposed to keep them apart. Charlotte is growing up in a world that will ask enormous things of her. She is third in line to the British throne. She is a princess in the oldest, most demanding sense of the word, a young woman being shaped by history and expectation, and the full weight of an institution that does not make room for half measures. She will spend her life in public. She will be watched and assessed and judged the way everyone in her family is, the way Camilla has been for over 2 decades. She will face moments when the world decides who she is before she has had the chance to decide for herself. But she will also have watched Camilla. She will have the evidence, gathered from years of quiet attention, that it is possible to walk through the world's judgment and come out the other side intact. That it is possible to be misunderstood by many people and still remain genuinely yourself. That dignity is not the absence of difficulty, but the decision to keep going through it with your character unmarked. That is what Camilla had given her, not intentionally, not as a lesson, but simply by example. By being visible in the right ways and human in the right moments, and consistent in a way that accumulates over time into something that children absorb without being taught. And Charlotte had given something back. She had given Camilla the knowledge that her example had been received, that someone was watching. That the long, strange, hard, beautiful journey from the woman, the world once condemned to the Queen of England being celebrated in a garden full of flowers on her 79th birthday. That journey had been witnessed by at least one pair of young eyes, and that what those eyes had seen had mattered. The afternoon stretched on. The cake was brought out and the candles were lit, and the family gathered in the way families do, slightly uneven in their positioning, making faces at each other across the table, someone slightly late to arrive from wherever they'd wandered. And Camilla stood at the center of it all, in the house she knew well, surrounded by people who loved her, on a birthday that had turned out to be full of more genuine emotion than anyone had predicted. She blew out the candles. The family cheered. Louis, the youngest and most reliably theatrical of the Wales children, cheered loudest of all in the magnificent, unself-conscious way of 6-year-olds. George laughed. Charlotte watched Camilla's face and smiled at what she saw there. And Charles, sitting just slightly to her left, reached across and took her hand, just held it. No speech, no grand gesture, just the hand. Later that evening, after the family had gone and the house had returned to its familiar quiet, Camilla was said to have gone back to the garden. This is apparently something she does, ends her evenings outside when the weather allows, in the garden that her husband built, and that she has come to love as though she had made it herself. She walked through it in the long July light, which in Gloucestershire in midsummer barely admits that darkness exists, the sky still pale and luminous at 9 in the evening. She had the letter in her pocket. She had carried it with her since Charlotte gave it to her that morning, moving it from room to room, the way you carry something you keep wanting to return to. In the garden, among the flowers and the quiet, she read it one more time. The world outside Highgrove knew almost nothing of what had happened inside it that day. What they knew was the portrait Camilla in the butterfly brooch, serene and smiling in a state drawing room. They knew the literacy announcement, the gift of books to children across the country, Camilla's commitment to the National Year of Reading rendered in a specific and generous act. They knew the birthday wishes from William and Catherine on social media, warm and brief, exactly as these things always are. But they did not know about the letter. They did not know about the moment in the room when Camilla had held Charlotte's face in both hands and said, "You see things, don't you?" They did not know about Charles and the flowers from the garden. They did not know about Catherine's words to a friend, or Charlotte sitting quietly beside her step-grandmother in the afternoon sun, or the way the birthday cake had tasted of an ordinary, uncomplicated happiness that was somehow the hardest kind to come by. They did not know that a woman of 79, who had carried the world's judgment for more than 2 decades, had spent her birthday being loved in the truest and most private way, not for her title, not for her resilience, not for the version of her that the palace released in official photographs, but for herself, for exactly who she was. Some birthdays are milestones. Some are celebrations of number, of decade, of significance attached to a particular age. This was not one of those. 79 is not a number that announces itself. It does not belong to the category of birthdays that the world stops to notice. But inside Highgrove on July 17, 2026, there was something happening that had nothing to do with numbers. There was a family gathered around a woman they loved. There was a king, ill but present, holding his wife's hand. There was a young princess who had paid attention and found the courage to say so. There was a garden full of flowers that had been tended for 30 years by someone who believed in planting for a future beyond himself. And there was Camilla, in the long light of a July evening, holding a child's letter in her pocket, standing among the flowers of her husband's garden, 79 years old and more herself than she had ever been. That was the real birthday. That was the real story. Not the crown, not the portrait, not the centuries of tradition that surround every royal occasion and shape it into something formal and manageable. Just this, a woman in a garden, a family who meant it, a girl who had seen clearly and said so. And all of it entirely, completely, undeniably real.